My name is Daniel Harper. I am 46 years old and I live in a small town outside of Ely, Nevada. I've worked as a maintenance supervisor for a regional power cooperative most of my adult life. The job is steady and predictable. It involves inspecting electrical substations, checking line equipment, recording readings, and making sure nothing is degrading faster than it should. A lot of driving. A lot of time alone. That kind of routine suits me. What I'm describing happened in 2018. At the time, I didn't think of it as anything more than an inconvenience. Looking back, it's the lack of clear explanation that stays with me. That year, one of my assigned sites was a substation located about 40 miles east of Ely. By Nevada standards, it wasn't extremely remote. There was a maintained access road and a marked gate. Still, it sat far enough from town that you rarely saw anyone else out there. Once you shut off your engine, there was almost no sound. No wind through trees. No traffic. Just the faint electrical hum from the equipment. My schedule had me visiting the site twice a week, usually early in the morning. I'd leave before sunrise, drive the same stretch of highway every time, turn off onto the access road, unlock the gate, and follow the same inspection routine. Walk the fence line. Check the transformers. Log the readings. Lock up and head back before noon. I'd been doing that exact routine for months without issue. In late September, I started noticing tire tracks on the access road that didn't belong to my truck. That wasn't unusual by itself. Hunters, ranchers, and occasionally off-roaders would cut through the area. But these tracks were fresh every time I came out, even after rain. They were wide and deep, like they came from a heavy-duty vehicle. I checked the schedule. No other company vehicles were assigned to that substation. I mentioned it to my supervisor during a weekly call. He said it was probably another crew passing through without logging it properly. That happens sometimes. I didn't push the issue. About a week later, I arrived just after sunrise and found the gate unlocked. The lock wasn't damaged. No signs of forced entry. It had been opened with the correct key. That bothered me more than the tire tracks. We were strict about access. Every visit was logged. Every lock change documented. I reported it, replaced the lock, and finished my inspection. Everything else looked normal. The next visit, the same thing happened. Unlocked gate. Fresh tire tracks. No record of another crew being scheduled. At that point, I started paying closer attention. I adjusted my schedule and began arriving earlier than usual. One morning, I pulled off the highway while it was still dark and shut off my headlights about a quarter mile from the site. I waited there for nearly 30 minutes. Nothing happened. No approaching lights. No engine noise. No movement. When daylight came, I drove in. The gate was locked. No tire tracks. The ground looked undisturbed. That should have reassured me. Instead, it made the situation feel less predictable. Over the next month, there was no consistent pattern. Sometimes the gate was untouched. Sometimes it was unlocked. Sometimes there were tire tracks. Sometimes there weren't. I never saw another vehicle. Never heard one coming or leaving. Around that time, I noticed something else. The equipment readings were slightly off during a few inspections. Not enough to trigger alarms or cause outages. Just small adjustments. The kind that looked intentional, like someone had changed a setting and then tried to put it back where it had been. I checked the maintenance logs. No entries besides mine. I reported that as well. My supervisor decided to send another technician out with me for the next visit. We spent the entire morning at the site together. We checked everything thoroughly. The gate was locked. No tire tracks. No unusual readings. Nothing out of place. As we were leaving, he asked me casually if I'd ever actually seen anyone else out there. I said no. He nodded and didn't say anything else. A few days later, I was back at the site alone. The gate was locked when I arrived, but something along the fence line caught my attention. One section near the rear of the property showed signs of disturbance. The dirt was scuffed and there were footprints leading up to the fence from the desert side. They stopped at the fence. There were no footprints on the inside. They weren't animal tracks. They were boot prints, adult-sized, deep enough to be clear, then fading as the ground turned rocky. I followed them back until they disappeared entirely. No vehicle tracks nearby. Just footprints that appeared, then ended. That was the first time I cut an inspection short. I logged what I could and left earlier than planned. After that, small things started happening. Nothing dramatic. A clipboard that wasn't where I remembered leaving it. A wrench on the ground instead of on the bench. Once, while I was inside the control building, my truck radio turned on by itself. When I got back to the cab, it was tuned to an AM station full of static. I checked the wiring later. There was nothing wrong with it. In November, I arrived mid-morning. The gate was locked. No tire tracks. Everything looked normal. As I was walking along the gravel path near the fence, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around, expecting to see another technician, a ranger, or maybe a hunter. There was no one there. I stood still. The sound stopped. I took a few steps forward. The footsteps started again. Same pace. Always behind me. Never close enough to see. I didn't panic. I didn't run. I finished the inspection quicker than usual and left. A month later, I transferred to a different district. Officially, it was a routine reassignment. No one asked many questions. The substation is still active. Other crews service it now. I've never asked if they noticed anything unusual. I don't know who was accessing that site. I don't know how they came and went without being seen. All I know is that it wasn't random and it wasn't careless. And whatever it was, it never wanted to be noticed. My name is Michael Lawson. I am 52 years old and I worked as a long-haul delivery driver based out of Springfield, Missouri for most of my adult life. I've driven freight across the Midwest for over 25 years. Most of that time was uneventful. You get used to long nights, empty roads, and quiet stops. You also learn what feels normal and what doesn't. What I'm about to describe happened in 2020, during the early months of the pandemic, when a lot of routines were already disrupted. At that time, freight schedules were inconsistent. Routes changed with little notice. Drivers were covering unfamiliar territory more often than usual. I was assigned a temporary overnight route delivering medical supplies to smaller clinics and hospitals across southern Missouri and northern Arkansas. One of those stops was a rural medical clinic outside a small town near Salem, Arkansas. It wasn't in town. It sat several miles out, surrounded by woods and farmland. The road leading to it was narrow, uneven, and poorly maintained. No streetlights. No nearby houses. At night, it was completely dark except for your headlights. The first time I made that delivery, I arrived just after midnight. The clinic was closed as expected. There was a secure drop area near the back entrance where drivers left shipments. I parked, unloaded, scanned the paperwork, and left. I didn't notice anything unusual. About a week later, I returned on the same route. This time, as I slowed down to turn into the clinic driveway, I noticed a car parked across the road. It was pulled off just far enough to be out of the lane. Headlights off. Engine off. No visible movement. I assumed it belonged to a staff member working late or maybe someone on call. Rural clinics sometimes have odd hours. I didn't think much of it. By the third visit, the car was there again. Same spot. Same angle. Still dark. What stood out was that it wasn't the same vehicle. This time it was a dark-colored SUV. That's when I started paying closer attention. From that point on, every time I arrived at the clinic overnight, there was a vehicle parked across the road. It was always positioned in roughly the same place. Always facing toward the clinic. Always unlit. The vehicles were different each time. Sedans, SUVs, pickup trucks. Never the same one twice. I never saw anyone inside. Never saw doors open or close. No engine starting. No headlights turning on while I was there. Once, after unloading, I sat in my cab for a few minutes before pulling out. I watched the parked vehicle through my side mirror. It didn't move. When I left and checked my mirrors again down the road, it was still there. After a few weeks, I mentioned it during a daytime delivery when clinic staff were present. I asked if they had overnight security or staff parked across the road at night. They said no. They told me the clinic closed completely overnight and that they hadn't noticed any vehicles parked there. I reported the situation to dispatch. They told me to note it in my logs and continue the route unless something more serious happened. Nothing dramatic happened right away. The pattern just continued. One night, I arrived and noticed the vehicle parked closer than usual. It was right at the edge of the clinic driveway. This time it was a pickup truck. Engine off. No lights. As I was unloading, I heard the sound of a door closing somewhere behind me. It wasn't loud. Just a brief metallic click, like a car door shutting gently. I turned around immediately. The pickup truck door was closed. Nothing else around. No movement in the woods. No other vehicles. I finished unloading quickly and got back into my cab. As I pulled out of the driveway, I saw the pickup's headlights turn on. They stayed on. The truck didn't move. The next delivery, there was no vehicle parked across the road. For the first time in weeks, the area was completely empty. The delivery after that, there were 2 vehicles. Both parked across the road. Both dark. One closer to the tree line. One closer to the shoulder. That was when I stopped getting out of the truck right away. I started sitting in the cab for a minute or 2 watching. Nothing ever happened. No lights turning on. No doors opening. No visible movement. It felt less like people waiting and more like the vehicles were simply being placed there. On my final delivery to that clinic, I arrived later than usual. Around 2:30 in the morning. I was behind schedule and tired. There was a single sedan parked across the road. As I stepped down from the cab, I noticed the driver's side window was open. That caught my attention immediately. I looked more closely and saw someone sitting in the driver's seat. They were completely still, hands on the steering wheel, head facing forward. I couldn't see their face clearly, just the outline of their head and shoulders. I stood there longer than I should have. They didn't move, didn't turn their head, didn't react to the sound of my truck or the loading door. I finished unloading while keeping my eyes on the car as much as possible. When I looked back again, the driver's seat was empty. The door was still closed. The window was still open. I didn't wait around to understand how that happened. I got back in my truck and left immediately. That was my last delivery to that clinic. I requested reassignment the next day and was approved without much discussion. I still drive. I still do overnight routes. I've never seen anything like that before or since. I don't know why those vehicles were there. I don't know who that person was or how they left the car without me seeing them. All I know is that the road felt watched and whatever was happening didn't need interaction to feel deliberate. My name is Thomas Reed. I am 61 years old, and I retired from my job as a park maintenance worker in northern Minnesota 5 years ago. From 2003 until 2019, I worked at a state forest campground located several miles outside of Grand Marais. It wasn't a large campground and it wasn't heavily visited outside of summer. Most of my work was seasonal. I handled trail inspections, restroom cleaning, campsite maintenance, and general upkeep. During peak season, I also stayed overnight in a small maintenance cabin on the property. It was a quiet job and that was part of the appeal. I worked mostly alone. I knew the layout of the campground well. I knew what sounds were normal and which ones weren't. Over time, you develop a sense for the place you work, especially when it's surrounded by forest and cut off from town. Every year, the campground closed for the winter. Once the gates were locked, no campers were supposed to be there until spring. The final task before winter was a full inspection. That included checking every building, securing equipment, shutting off water lines, and confirming the property was empty. In November of 2016, I was assigned to perform the final inspection. It was standard procedure for me to stay overnight in the maintenance cabin during that process. That way I could finish everything in one trip and lock the gates in the morning. That evening, everything went as expected. I finished the inspections before dark, returned to the cabin, made dinner, and settled in. The weather was cold but calm. No wind. No snow yet. Sometime after midnight, I heard footsteps outside. They were on gravel. Slow and steady. Not rushed. Not dragging. At first, I assumed it was a camper who hadn't left before the gates were locked. It happens occasionally. Usually they realize their mistake and leave quietly. I got up, put on my jacket, and went outside with a flashlight. The campground was empty. No vehicles. No tents. No lights. No movement. I stood there for a moment, listening. The footsteps had stopped. I didn't see anything out of place, so I went back inside and locked the door. I didn't think much about it after that. The next morning, while doing one final walkthrough, I noticed footprints near the restroom building. They were boot prints, adult-sized, only one set. What stood out was that there were no tracks leading in from the access road. Just footprints around the building, then nothing. I documented it in my report and finished locking up. The following year, during the November inspection, I heard footsteps again. Same sound, same pace, always after dark. Once again, I checked outside. Once again, the campground was empty. The next morning, there were footprints. Different location. Same situation. No clear path in or out. Over the next 2 years, this became a pattern. Every winter inspection involved some version of the same thing. Footsteps at night. Evidence in the morning. No sign of forced entry. No damage. Nothing missing. In one instance, I found a picnic table moved several feet from its usual spot. It wasn't overturned or broken, just relocated slightly as if someone had adjusted it and left. There were no tire tracks, no signs of snowmobile use, no reports of trespassing during the off-season. I never felt panicked, just confused. In 2018, I decided to set up a trail camera near the main loop road during my overnight stay. I placed it in a position where it would capture anyone walking through the campground. The footage showed nothing unusual. No animals, no people, no vehicles. The audio, however, recorded footsteps. Clear gravel crunching. A steady walking pace. The sound moved past the camera, paused briefly, then continued. There was nothing visible in the frame. I checked the camera multiple times. It hadn't malfunctioned. The timestamps were accurate. During my final year before retirement, December of 2019, I did my last winter inspection. Snow had already fallen, covering most of the ground. I stayed overnight as usual. I didn't hear footsteps that night. I woke up just before dawn. The cabin was quiet. Outside, the campground was completely still. When I stepped outside, I saw footprints in the snow. They circled the cabin. They stopped directly in front of the door. There were no tracks leading away. I checked the door. It was still locked from the inside. I finished the inspection, locked the gates, and left later that morning. I reported what I saw, same as always. The campground was closed permanently the following year due to budget cuts. Since retiring, I've thought about that place more than I expected to. I don't believe it was haunted. I don't believe it was anything supernatural. But I do believe something was present during those winter months. Something that moved through the campground when it was empty. Something that followed the same routines I did. And whatever it was, it never needed to come inside to let me know it was there.